It is now time to introduce our special guest. We're happy to have with us tonight Irminne Van Dyken, MD. Irminne Van Dyken, MD, is a general and trauma surgeon at the Queen's Medical Center in Hawaii, who thoroughly enjoys her busy practice, and it is especially rewarding for her to see the positive changes in her patients as they do a 180-degree change and completely restructure their lives around plant-based living. In her spare time, Dr. Van Dyken loves yoga, photography, sailing, cycling, and playing musical instruments, including the guitar, ukulele, and the violin. She shares her life with her husband, Russell, her 14-year-old dog, Chaucer, and 2 cats. She has been vegetarian since she was 9 years old and strictly plant-based since 2010. She has a passion for educating others and sharing the benefits of healthy plant-based living. She and Russell created Out of the Doldrums, a YouTube channel and online presence promoting healthy, active, plant-based living. And that's on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Her presentation tonight is entitled Inflammaging: How Chronic Low-Grade Inflammation is at the Root of Cellular Aging and Results in Chronic Disease. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Irminne Van Dyken.
So what are we going to talk about tonight? Well, we'll start by talking about aging. What is it? And inflammation, what is that? And how are they related? What is this weird thing called inflammaging that keeps popping up? We're going to talk about all that. And we're going to introduce something that's brand new, first time debuted ever, the Out of the Doldrums 5-pronged approach to healthy aging. So we're going to talk about 5 unique ways that I have found in all of the research that I've done that is the most evidence-based way to slow down aging and slow down inflammation. So let's start with a poll. How many of you guys want to live to 100? Conditional, cautious hand raise. How many of you want to live to 100 if you could live to be a healthy 100? That's better. How many of you want to live to 100 if the last 20 years of your life you are bedridden and debilitated and cannot move around and have chronic disease? Okay, I think we're all in agreement with that. Let's talk about the global situation. Life expectancy has increased worldwide. We used to only live 61 years in 1980. If you look at the numbers in 2015, the average lifespan is 71 years. That's a long time. And what's interesting about that is as we're living longer as humans, we're also getting more chronic diseases. So about half of all adults today have one chronic health condition. That's a big number. And then if you compound that, 1 in 4 adults have 2 or more chronic health conditions. So our lifespan is increasing. Our health span is decreasing, meaning we are not healthy as long in our life. And what it comes down to is our elders are sicker longer. We are having older people that are not living into a healthy old age. They are living into an unhealthy old age. And this is becoming an epidemic. How can we reverse that? Well, let's back up. Let's talk about aging. What is aging? How do you define aging? Come on and shout it out. When you see somebody and you say, oh, that person is aged, what do we notice about them? Okay, wrinkles. Okay, what else? Posture, yeah, your spine isn't quite so straight. You might start hunching over a little bit. What else?
Sarcopenia.
What is sarcopenia? Sarcopenia is the medical term for losing muscle mass. So as we get older, we lose our muscle mass. And then lastly, increased weight. So what we notice is we're weighing more, even though we're having less muscle because we're getting more obese. So this is all stuff we see in the mirror, right? When we look at ourselves and we notice we're aging. But what about what's going on a cellular level? What's happening that's causing us to age? Well, we know our immune function decreases big time as we age. We also know that there's increased inflammation, and we'll talk about that and how you measure that. This results in cardiovascular disease, many different types of cancers, diabetes, depression, and the worst feared one of all, cognitive decline. If you talk to people about healthy aging, the one thing they fear is getting dementia, is losing their mind, not living to a healthy old age. And that's one of the hallmarks of inflammation and chronic aging. So let's back up and talk about chronologic versus biologic age. So what's chronologic age? Years. Yeah, so I'm 50 years old, that's my chronologic age, right? What about biologic age? So it's how old you really are physically. How old is your body? You could have a chronologic age of 50, but your biologic age could be 30. You'd be doing very well, right? Alternatively, you could have a chronologic age of 50 and a biologic age of 70. That's a plausible thing too. So we can't go by chronologic age, we have to go by biologic age. So how and why exactly do we age? Anybody know? Who's got the secret answer? None of us know. That's the million-dollar question. This is the fountain of youth that scientists have been researching and trying to find for centuries, right? I can tell you we're getting closer. We're figuring out associations and links between certain things that speed up aging or slow them down. And we're starting to find out the best ways that we can actually slow down that entire aging process. This lady holds the world record for the longest recorded lifespan ever. And she lived to be 122 years old. She lived in France, and she did have an apartment where she had to walk up and down the stairs. She had a beautiful apartment. And some guy, I think he was a businessman, made a bet against her, and he said, well, how about I give you this amount of money, which was a bargain, and he said, when you die, then I get your apartment. She says, okay. And she ended up outliving him. But what's interesting about her, she was always up for new things. She took up fencing, brand new sport to her at the age of 85. She was still riding a bicycle at 100. Props for that. And of course, she had a reason why she lived so long. She said she lived so long because of the olive oil, the port wine, and 1 whole kilo of chocolate weekly. So as scientists, we see this, we say, well, okay, that's an N of 1, right? One person. We can't base science and recommendations off of that, right? And we also can't base it because she smoked like a chimney. So what about her caused her to live old? There she is lighting her 100th birthday cake. They say the only reason she quit smoking is because she couldn't hold the cigarette between her fingers anymore because of her tremor. And that was at about 112 years old. So she probably had a genetic mutation, not a mutation, but an anomaly, in a gene called the FOXO gene, which is a gene that's known for longevity. There are certain people who have this gene, about 1% to 2% of the population. They can do whatever they want, and they will live to be old and healthy old. That's great. But what about the rest of us, the other 98, 99%? We're not quite that lucky. But the one thing I thought was interesting, and this is a quote from her, she said, always keep your smile. That's how I explain my long life. So she had a very positive outlook on life, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit too. So what's the key to longevity, that million-dollar question? What can we do to try to improve our overall health to obtain the longest, healthiest life possible? Which brings us to inflammaging. So inflammation and aging and longevity are all interrelated. And I'm going to talk about that in detail. But the term inflammaging was invented by a guy named Claudio Franceschi, and he published it in the early 2000s. And he published it because he found this link between inflammatory markers that you could measure in the blood and aging. He knew there was a link between inflammation and aging. And one of the things he said in this paper, as a result of what he'd observed, is that chronic low-grade inflammation develops, which is a major contributor to age-associated frailty, morbidity, and mortality. So what is inflammation? It's a pretty fancy word, but what exactly is it? How do you describe inflammation? What's the process? Anybody?
Blood rushes to an area to help heal it.
Good, yeah. So you're kind of calling in the troops to go and heal. You blood rushing somewhere, yeah, that's very good. Anything else? Yeah, so also kind of along the same lines, a continued agitation of an area, and your body's trying to fix it. Yeah, that's good. So some of the hallmarks of inflammation we know as scientists are as follows. We know it can be triggered by DNA damage, wear and tear. We know it's very closely linked to cellular aging from telomere shortening. Just a show of hands, how many of you have heard of telomeres? Okay, pretty good. Okay, well, we'll talk about them in a little more detail, but that's an important part of this whole picture. Accumulation of cellular waste. When you have byproducts and you can't get rid of them in your body, that contributes to inflammation. DNA mutations, again, if we have a DNA mutation and we cannot repair it, that's going to contribute to inflammation. Oxidative stress from free radicals. And then lastly, genetics. There is a genetic component. So those are the big causes, the intertwined things with inflammation. So forgive me for 1 second. I'm going to put on my science hat. Bear with me for 5 minutes. We're going to talk science. Once we're done with the science, then we can back up and you'll have a better understanding and we can talk about how to implement some things. So this picture shows us aging is a complex thing. There's a lot of different attributes for that. We have, of course, inflammation, which is the subject of what I'm going to be talking about, but there's other stuff, like epigenetics. So epigenetics is when we have DNA that replicates. We have these little things that are epigenetics that sit on our DNA, and they decide whether or not a gene is going to be expressed or not. And then they also decide whether that's going to be passed on to our children and our children's children. So epigenetics is very important. We have metabolism, so what we eat, how it's processed in our body. We've got adaptation to stress, which is very important when it comes to aging. How does our body deal with stress? Some stresses are good. Our body likes to have a certain amount of stress, like exercise, right? So getting back to what Ernest was talking about, the signs of inflammation. We learned this in medical school. These are the signs of inflammation, that there's something going on in our body. So we have heat, we have redness, we have swelling, pain, and then we have loss of function. All of those things intertwined contribute to inflammation. Now what's interesting is we have acute inflammation and we have chronic inflammation. So acute inflammation is going to be when you cut your toe or you stub your toe. You have to mobilize the troops, your immune system, your cells, to go to that area to heal you and fix you. Otherwise, you could have an infection that would potentially kill you. Similarly, when you're sick, say with the flu, this is acute inflammation. Your body is sending all of these inflammatory cells to one area to heal it. And this is a good thing. We need this in order to stay alive. Another example of acute inflammation is exercise. Running, getting out there, getting your heart pumping is actually acute inflammation, and it's good for our bodies. When we get to low-grade chronic inflammation, it's the enemy of healthy aging. So something happens that transitions the acute inflammation to chronic inflammation, and hence the inflammaging. So what we see with inflammaging, there's many things that happen when you have this inflammation that goes on low grade for a long period of time. So you can have development of certain cancers when you have this inflammation. You have a decrease in your immune system because it's overtaxed, working all the time. You can have altered body composition and loss of mobility, so you don't move around quite as much as you normally would. You can get a decline in your cognition, your mental well-being. And then we also know with chronic inflammation that starts chronic diseases like diabetes, insulin resistance, and even heart disease. Heart disease, atherosclerosis, is one of our typical inflammatory diseases. If you take a look at an atherosclerotic plaque, so a plaque that's in a hardened artery, for example, you see inflammation all over it. So that's one of those things, again, related to chronic inflammation. So let's talk about some lifestyle choices that trigger inflammation. There's one I'm thinking of that's kind of the most common prototypical thing you can do to trigger inflammation in your body. Did I hear smoking? Yeah, okay. So smoking is one of those things that triggers inflammation. When you have a cigarette, you do ingest hundreds of different chemicals, one of them being benzene, that actually is a direct carcinogen. That is an inflammatory trigger. There's other things that can cause inflammation. We know people that are obese or have more obese cells in their body actually harbor inflammatory markers in those cells. Food. You can eat pro-inflammatory foods, you can eat anti-inflammatory foods. It makes a difference what you put in your body. Inactivity, so being sedentary, a couch potato, not watching TV, another reason to be in a pro-inflammatory state. Stress, believe it or not, can cause inflammation. Hormone imbalances can do it. And lastly, toxic chemical exposures. There's a lot of chemicals we're exposed to these days that can cause chronic low-grade inflammation. Here's the science I was talking about. Bear with me. This pathway, called the NF-kappa B, very, very important when it comes to inflammation. It's activated by over 150 different stimuli, so things like UV radiation, carcinogens, cytokines, bacteria, viruses, they all activate this NF-kappa B pathway. And what happens with that pathway as it enters into the cell, the NF-kappa B actually gets to the DNA in the nucleus of the cell and alters the way that that DNA is expressed, resulting in inflammatory proteins and chronic inflammation. The next pathway I'm going to talk about also starts with an N. One is good and one is bad. So in order to remember it, I'm going to leave a little icon. So the NF-kappa B is going to have the little devil icon by it, okay? Pro-inflammatory. The NF-kappa B pathway does many things. It promotes inflammation. It also causes cells to proliferate unchecked, which can result in cancers, etc. And it contributes to angiogenesis, the formation of heart disease. Here's the other pathway, the good pathway. We're going to denote that one with angel wings. This is the NRF2 pathway. This is also a very, very important pathway. What it does is it decreases chronic inflammation in your body. It regulates over 200 different genes, and it deactivates carcinogens. It helps you get rid of carcinogens, and it also activates antioxidants. This NF-kappa B pathway has been shown to be activated and increased in activity with certain foods and with certain lifestyle choices we're going to go over. So it's like flipping a switch on or off with inflammation. It's an oversimplification, but in a way it's a good way to think about it. The NF-kappa B pathway is pro-inflammatory. You can switch that on, doing certain things like smoking, for example. You can also switch it off by doing other things and activating the opposite pathway, the NRF2 pathway. A little more science, then we'll be out of the woods. We have to talk about the microbiome, only because I love the microbiome and it's very important when it comes to inflammation. So the microbiome is not our human cells, but it's cells that live on, in, and around us. Bacteria, fungus, protozoa, viruses, good and bad. For every one human cell we have, there's 10 of those guys. They dictate a lot in our life. They dictate many things, including inflammation. So we know if we can have an optimal microbiome, we can decrease inflammation in our body. And the microbiome, I refer you to some of the lectures on the VSH YouTube channel. They talk about how to manipulate your microbiome, how to get a healthy microbiome. When we talk about the microbiome, we have to talk about the cell wall lining of the gut. So we have your small intestine, you have your colon. There's only one layer of epithelial cells that separates the inside of your colon from the rest of your body. So there's one cell layer that blocks all the bacteria that's in the poo, the feces, from your body. And that's important because we need to absorb nutrients. We need to absorb a lot of stuff through this one cell wall layer. When that works correctly, we have healthy, tight junctions. The junctions between this cell wall layer are very tight. Not much can get through there. But if something happens where we have inflammation or an issue, we get a faulty tight junction. That junction opens up, we have a gap, and we get toxins from inside the colon into our body, and that can be a big problem. A lot of these toxins are inflammatory mediators. So how does that work with what we do? Well, if we look at infection, we look at inflammation. We look at what we eat, our diet, whether we choose pizza versus broccoli, right? That's going to dictate how our microbiome looks. We're going to look at xenobiotics, which is chemicals, medicines, pills, things we're exposed to in our day-to-day living. That's going to alter our microbiome. Hygiene, how clean we are or how not clean we are, is going to alter our microbiome. And then our genetics. If we have a healthy microbiome, we're good. Our inflammation levels should be pretty low. But if we have dysbiosis, which is an altered balance of good to bad bacteria, then we're going to have issues with chronic diseases. All these diseases on the bottom have been linked to dysbiosis, or the imbalance of the microbiome. Autism, asthma, for example, fatty liver disease, obesity, all this has been related. What we know about the microbiome is as we age, we have decreased diversity. So a diverse microbiome is a different population, many different types of bacteria that live in your gut, on your skin, etc. As we age, we find that diversity goes down, especially if we're not taking care of our microbiome. One study recently showed that if you do optimize your microbiome and you take care of it, you can have the same diversity as younger people, but you have to work at it. So it takes a little more work. The last science topic we're going to talk about is telomeres. So telomeres, if you look at our chromosome, which happens to look like this X here, telomeres are those little caps on the end. And what they do is every time that our chromosomes or our cell divides, these telomeres protect our real DNA. And the telomeres, they sacrifice themselves just a little bit. They get shorter and shorter every time they divide. And what happens is after so many cell divisions, when you're getting towards the end of your life, your telomeres are very short. They can't protect your DNA anymore, so it unravels. And that causes cell damage. And cell damage is a very bad thing to have. So you could liken it to shoelaces. If you think about your shoelace, the little plastic cap on the end of your shoelace could represent your telomere. And what happens is it protects your DNA or your shoelace. And as soon as that little plastic cap wears down and gets to your DNA or your shoelace, it unravels, and we have an issue there. There was a lady named Elizabeth Blackburn. She got a Nobel Prize for discovering an enzyme called telomerase. This happened about 10 years ago or so, and what she found was this enzyme rebuilds telomeres. She found that you can lengthen your telomeres, meaning as your cell divides and your telomeres get shorter and shorter, if your telomerase is active, your telomeres can build themselves back up again, thereby insulating you from aging and cell damage. That make sense? So telomerase was a huge discovery. And we're finding different things that can lengthen your telomeres or make your telomerase more active versus the opposite thing. In general, though, younger people have longer telomeres, older people have shorter telomeres. And what happens is as our cells divide, when they get to a point when they can't divide safely anymore, when the telomeres are gone, they have to do a couple things. They either go under apoptosis, so they get they commit suicide and they're absorbed by the body, or they become senescent cells, or they become cancer cells. Cancer cells, usually they're not a bad deal. Our immune system picks them up and gets rid of them and they're not a problem. Senescent cells, I would argue, are a bigger issue. They kind of are retired cells. They just sit back. They produce all of these toxic chemicals that cause a lot of inflammation around them, and they don't just stick to themselves. They influence everybody around them. So all the other cells, just from one senescent cell, can go senescent and cause massive inflammation. So you could equilibrate that to one senescent cell being like a rotten apple in a barrel of apples. So one senescent cell, one rotten apple could ruin the whole barrel, could ruin a lot of the apples or a lot of the cells that are in your body. Okay, so that's the main science stuff. Let's talk about chronic low-grade inflammation. I call it the silent killer, because we can't look in a mirror and see, oh man, I have inflammation today, right? We can't really measure it just by looking or how we feel. So how do we know whether it's going on? Well, we could wait till it gets advanced and we have all these diseases that are characterized by chronic low-grade inflammation, things like atherosclerosis or heart disease, Alzheimer's disease, some cancers, etc. But arguably, that might be a little too late. Wouldn't we want to catch it before it gets to that stage? Well, luckily we can test for it, and this is what scientists do to test for chronic low-grade inflammation. So we could get a test called the C-reactive protein, or CRP. You can get that test, you can look at the number, and kind of get a pretty rough gauge of how much inflammation is going on. Similarly, you could get a white blood cell test, but that's kind of, not very specific, not a good thing. If you have anything else going on in your body, any infection, your white blood cell count will be up. You could also measure your TNFA, your tumor necrosis factor alpha, which is always hanging around if you have chronic inflammation, or IL-6, or your telomeres. We can measure your telomere length just by drawing your blood. We can figure out how long they are. Something lots of people want to know. So CRP, again, you want to make sure if you get it measured, you don't have any sort of infection or something obvious like an injury or sprained ankle going on, because it will be high because of that. Otherwise, CRP levels, this is pretty much an indicator showing if you've got high CRP levels, for example, a woman, she's got a super high above 7 CRP, she's at a 5.5 times risk of chronic disease. Luckily, there's ways we can lower our CRP. So we've got this complex problem. We talked about the science. We talked about what a big issue it is. But the million-dollar question is, how can we decrease chronic low-grade inflammation and thereby prolong healthy aging? We know the two of them are related. How can we decrease that chronic inflammation? If only there was a pill we could take, some simple anti-aging pill we could just pop every day and be good with it. There's not, but there's other ways. There definitely is. So let's talk about them. So we've got a 5-prong approach to healthy aging, to reducing inflammation in your body. Very simple, 5 different things. We'll talk about each of them in sequence. First one is food. Of course it's going to be food. How could it not be food, right? The most important thing you can do in your body to decrease inflammation. Number 2 is exercise. That's, of course, a pretty important one. 3, this is where it starts to get a little hairy. Mindful living. Many, many studies have linked that to lower inflammation. Then your sleep. Sleep deprivation is a big deal. People can get fellowships in just sleep medicine if they're doctors. That's how important it is. And then the last one is a periodic reboot. We're going to talk about all this. So let's start with the food. What's a good example of an anti-inflammatory diet? Okay, plant-based is good. I was hoping somebody would yell out vegan diet and I would say wrong. Because we all know, right, that you can be a junk food vegan, right? Oreos are vegan, French fries are vegan. What kind of nutritional value does that have? But whole foods, right? Whole foods is the best thing you can do. We know that people who eat plants, vegetables in particular, have lower inflammatory markers. So this population that was studied demonstrated that if you're vegetarian, you have a lower C-reactive protein and a lower IL-6, just by including vegetables in your diet. This wasn't even strict vegetarians, this was just vegetarians. So remember how we were talking about the switch, what we can do to turn it on, turn it off? In all the research that I did, I read hundreds of papers for this talk, literally, and many books. I found 3 things that kept coming up as the best switch turners to decrease inflammation. So we're going to talk about them. I'm calling them the big 3. First one, anybody know what this is? What kind of sprouts? Broccoli sprouts. So what's super interesting about broccoli sprouts is they have a chemical called sulforaphane in them. Sulforaphane is one of the most potent activators of that NRF2, the good pathway that I talked about, out of everything. Other cruciferous vegetables have sulforaphane in them, but not to the extent broccoli sprouts do. One broccoli sprout, one of those teeny little things, a 2-day-old broccoli sprout, has more sulforaphane than an entire broccoli plant. It's easy to do. Anybody ever sprouted? It's kind of fun. You have a mason jar, you put some broccoli seeds in the bottom, soak them overnight, and then rinse them twice a day. In a couple days, you have sprouts. Pretty cheap, too, for a nutritious green. So that's number 1. Number 2. Anybody know what this is? You guys are good. Okay, so olena, or turmeric, right? Also known as curcumin, which is the chemical that all of its health and well-being effects are attributed to, is the curcumin. And we know pretty much the same thing. Curcumin also activates that NRF2 pathway, which is very important. And it decreases that NF-kappa B, the bad pathway, which is also very important. Additionally, curcumin or turmeric, along with broccoli sprouts, is investigated by many scientists currently for decreasing all sorts of chronic disease, cancers, heart disease, infections even, that sort of stuff. It's a very, very good chemical. And it's whole plants. You can get turmeric root and put it in your salad, put it in your smoothie, whatever you want to do, you'll get that nutritional value. The last one is green tea. So what I found in my research is this chemical here, EGCG from green tea, also very, very good antioxidant, very potent mediator and activator of the NRF2 pathway. So those are my big 3. Let's talk a little more about food. I want to take a minute and talk about the bad guys, the bandits, the ones that cause inflammation in your body. Well, we've got the saturated fats, so fats that are solid at room temperature. We have trans fats. Those are going to be the lards, the margarine, deep-fried foods. We've got omega-6 foods. Most of the omega-6s are going to be meat, dairy, eggs. Vegetable oils are in that too. We have the high glycemic index foods. Think sugary pastry donut, Christmas cookies, whatever's in your break room this time of year. Those are the high glycemic index foods. And then foods that have no antioxidants, foods that have very little to no nutritional value. You want to avoid all these foods at all costs. So when we talk about inflammaging and low-grade inflammation, there's many factors that play a role. So we have our healthy eating pattern, prudent diet, Mediterranean diet, whole grains. I'm going to talk about fish in a minute, because I have a bone to pick with that one. Fruits, vegetables, nuts, other foods. And then we've got the things that make our microbiota healthy. So prebiotics, omega-3 fatty acids, polyphenols, probiotics. These are the big things we want to include in our diet. When we do that, we have less inflammation, less inflammaging, better gut microbiota. This passes on to our cells, our tissues, our organs, and then we have more overall health and well-being. Now here's the thing with fish. People really like fish because it's got those omega-3 fatty acids. Where do we think those omega-3 fatty acids come from? It comes from the algae they eat in the ocean. The purest, most potent source of omega-3s is going to be algae-derived, and they're going to be relatively clean sources. These fish that eat the algae, they eat other things too. They eat PCBs, they eat plastics. I just read today, since plastic was invented, over 9 billion tons of plastic has been just dumped away into our oceans, into landfills, whatever it happens to be. And a lot of these plastics turn into microplastics, get eaten by the fish, and we in turn eat them. It's a big issue. So when we talk about an anti-inflammatory diet, we're talking about whole food. We're talking about plants. That's going to be everything up there. Whole grains, vegetables, legumes, fruits, nuts, all of those have been individually studied and shown to decrease chronic inflammation. Other things, we are going to spend a few minutes on omega-3s, but these other minerals and vitamins are very important to lowering inflammation. Vitamin D, for example. Did you know 70% of all Americans are deficient in vitamin D? Even in Hawaii, when we have sunlight. I recommend everybody get their vitamin D level checked, and you may need a supplement until you get those back to normal. Vitamin D regulates over 200 different genes in your body. If you think that it doesn't play a role in inflammation, you're wrong, because it plays a huge role. We've got our other vitamins. We have minerals, selenium, zinc. Zinc is important for wound healing. Magnesium should be up there. It's also very important when it comes to inflammation. And then we've got our phytochemicals, antioxidants, and polyphenol-rich foods. So let's talk about omega-3s. We need to have this EPA, DHA in our body. Omega-3 fatty acids nutritionally have probably been one of the things that have been the most studied out of a lot of the macronutrients that we talk about. If you want to get them from whole foods, you sure can. You can get flax, hemp seeds, chia seeds are another good source, walnuts, soybeans, all good, very good sources of omega-3s. They decrease inflammatory markers. So the TNF-alpha, IL-1, CRP, these all decrease with omega-3 fatty acid intake. Now I know this was done on marine fatty acids, but a lot of this fatty acid data does translate over to the algae-derived, which are arguably more potent and more pure. If we look at telomere length in this graph, remember, longer telomeres is better. And then we look at omega-3 fatty acids. The people in the study that had the highest omega-3 intake had the longest telomeres. Directly related. Interesting stuff. So how much omega-3s do you need? Well, the Institute of Medicine came up with this graph. It varies for how old you are. If you are a young infant or in utero, you definitely need omega-3s. That contributes to brain development. If you are a female who's pregnant or nursing, for the same reason, you need high omega-3s. The American Heart Association even recommends omega-3 fatty acids to lower high triglyceride levels as a supplement. So there's tons of studies, like I said, on omega-3 fatty acids. I can't list all the references, but I will tell you they do many things, such as improve severe eczema, improve blood sugar management, decrease risk of atherosclerosis, decrease risk of cardiovascular disease in diabetics, lower triglyceride levels, lower LDL, which is our bad cholesterol, reduce your systolic blood pressure, improve your weight loss, improve your muscle mass, cause reduced symptoms in multiple sclerosis, improve symptoms in inflammatory bowel disease like Crohn's disease, etc., reduce stroke risk, and lastly, that feared cognitive decline. They can reduce cognitive decline. So very important we get those, whether it's from whole foods or supplements. Moving on to antioxidants and polyphenol-rich foods. These are some other very important ones that have been studied, shown to decrease inflammatory biomarkers. So lycopene from tomatoes, right? Cooked tomatoes lowers your TNF-alpha and CRP levels. Who's heard of astaxanthin? Anybody take it? Okay. It's an interesting one. It's pretty new. It's a supplement that comes from algae as well, and it's also very, very anti-inflammatory. Preliminary studies have shown a lot of good data when it comes to specific inflammation, like in arthritis, etc. It's shown to be very good. Vitamin D we touched on already. Tea we touched on already. Cocoa has been shown to lower CRP levels. And then lastly, cruciferous vegetables. They can decrease your IL-6 by 20%. Some more phytochemical-rich foods you always want to improve and put in your diet: turmeric, ginger, garlic, onion, pineapple, and chili peppers. So those are good ones. You can easily incorporate those into your diet. So let's back up. Let's talk about DNA. What about our DNA? What if we have a gene that predisposes us to Alzheimer's or heart disease? Good. Yeah, so there's a lot of genes that don't get expressed, and it's all about gene expression. So what we know is that our environmental conditions, whether we are exposed to toxins or not, our diet is going to affect genetic mechanisms. So being in an anti-inflammatory state can determine whether a lot of these genes can be turned on or off. Now, it's not a guarantee. There are some genes that no matter what you do are going to be expressed, unfortunately, but you can definitely improve your odds by staying in an anti-inflammatory state. This one isn't really made to read. I made this after reading all of the papers on foods and what's pro-inflammatory, what's anti-inflammatory. It is up on our Out of the Doldrums website, so there's some cards in the back. If you guys want to pick them up, you can reference this anytime online. But what it is, essentially, we have the most anti-inflammatory foods at the top. We've got turmeric, broccoli, sprouts, cruciferous vegetables, berries, and a whole spectrum. The green is very good foods, anti-inflammatory foods. The yellow is the neutral foods, neither good nor bad. And the red's going to be the pro-inflammatory foods. So the processed meat, red meat, fish, cheese are all on the bottom here. We've got some neutral foods and then the good foods. So it's kind of a good reference if you want to reference what some good anti-inflammatory foods are. Feel free to check that one out. Okay, we're on to physical activity. That was food. Ooh, that was a big one. But that was the biggest of them all, the most dense topic. So let's talk about exercise. What's so good about exercise? Why do we care? You know, you go to the doctor or you talk to anybody, they say eating healthy is diet and exercise, and you don't really ever talk about what is exercise, what is diet, why is it so good? Well, let's talk briefly. We know that being physically active is directly linked to telomere length, meaning the more active you are, the longer your telomeres, theoretically the slower you age, right? This was a study done on about 48 people. Complicated graph, but what I wanted to show you is this line in the middle is the neutral line. Everything to the left means that exercise did not contribute to telomere length. Everything on the right in all these studies, if you're on the right of the graph, showed that activity was good. So what this graph shows is almost every single study proved that exercise is beneficial when it comes to telomere length. Then there was a group of scientists that looked at stress and exercise. What if you have a super stressful job? Is exercise going to help? Or you're so tired and stressed, is that really going to change your telomere length? Well, actually it does. And it's even more important the older you are. So, if you have a high stress job and you go, this light gray bar is high activity, you're going to have longer telomeres at the end of the day, which is really encouraging to know. You don't want to be skipping your exercise. So when we talk about exercise, how much? What type? What's the best kind of exercise? Any idea? What's that? Walking. What else? Swimming, yeah. There's all different types. And the thing is that there's no expert consensus, meaning none of the experts really agree on that. But what we can tell you is anything that gets your heart rate up, so an aerobic exercise, whether it's walking, jogging, swimming, weightlifting even, as long as you get your heart rate up, that's going to be good for you from an inflammation and aging standpoint. One of the ways to do this, and probably the most frequently recommended, is going to be moderate exercise, 3 times a week, 45-minute sessions. So not even every day, 3 times a week. What we just did for 30 seconds, high-intensive interval training. Basically getting up, doing some exercise as much as you can, as fast as you can, for less than 2 minutes. It's been shown to be very good when it comes to telomere health. Remember though, if it's telomeres that you really care about, it takes about 6 months to adjust your telomere length. But you'll feel the effects from regular exercise much sooner. Who's heard of this? That saying, sitting is the new smoking, you guys heard that? Yeah. That's the new slogan. Studies are showing that more screen-based behavior, meaning the more you're sitting in a couch watching a TV or looking at a screen, the shorter your telomeres are. That's interesting. Another study showed that the more that you stand, the more you avoid being sedentary, the longer your telomeres. So it's all very good evidence, compounded on multiple other studies showing that cardiovascular exercise contributes to longevity. Okay, we're on to number 3, mindful living. This is where you guys have to say, oh my gosh, Dr. Van Dyken has gone crazy. She's a doctor. She shouldn't be talking about this type of stuff. I thought it was a little foo-foo too until I read the literature. It's amazing how much there is in the literature about mindfulness, health, and longevity. So meditation or mindfulness has been shown to directly reduce inflammation with many inflammatory biomarkers. It reduces NF-kappa B activity, which is that bad pathway we talked about. It reduces CRP, IL-6, which are inflammatory biomarkers, and it increases telomere length. Mindfulness increases telomere length. That's interesting. Lastly, it slows down neuroaging and cognitive decline. So when we talk about mindfulness, it really is about attitude. Attitude is everything. There was one study that showed people who have positive psychological characteristics have longer telomeres. What do I mean by positive psychological characteristics? That's a complex word. Well, positive affect, meaning overall you're pretty positive. Life satisfaction, that you're feeling like you're here for a purpose and you're satisfied. That's important. Having the trait of mindfulness, the trait of emotional intelligence, general self-efficacy, meaning that you're doing a good job on your own, you feel that, and then optimism. Optimism. All those are characteristics of longer telomeres. Those two have been linked. So let's flip the coin. What about the pessimists? Are they in trouble? Well, yeah, they are. The higher of a pessimist you were, the shorter your average telomere length. That's interesting. So just your outlook, your mindset can change your telomere length. Kind of makes sense. Here's another one. In postmenopausal women, same thing. Pessimism correlates with your telomere length. Who would have known? So what can we do to try to really improve our mindfulness? Doesn't necessarily mean meditation for hours a day like monks do, right? It just means being present, trying not to focus on the future or the past and just being in the present. Some examples of mindfulness are walking without your smartphone on, just being present and walking. That's a very good way to do it. Going back to our 122-year-old lady, this is a quote from her. I never wear mascara. I laugh until I cry too often. So she was a very optimistic person, embracing life. So on to number 4. Let's talk about sleep. Sleep is super important. And there's so many people that are sleep deprived, believe it or not. Sleep is a complex process. It involves the entire body. It's normal for essential function. Metabolism regulation is one of the things regulated by sleep. Hunger, appetite, cravings, and creativity. Studies have shown that people who are sleep deprived are not as creative. And then there's one thing, not to get too sciencey again, but something called the glymphatic system. Anybody heard of that? Yeah, so the glymphatic system is kind of like the lymphatic system, but in your brain. It's these little microglia that actually clean out toxins and clean up your brain as you sleep. But the key is you have to sleep. So let's look at insomnia and telomere length. We all know this when we're younger, we can tolerate sleep deprivation much better, right? Well, this graph shows it. So we have age here. On the left is 60 to 69 years old. On the right is over 70. You can see that the people that were over age 70, if they had insomnia, their telomere length was shorter. They couldn't tolerate it as well. Whereas the people that were younger could tolerate sleep deprivation much better. So it becomes important to instill good sleep habits early on in your life. So how much sleep do you need? Who knows? It varies, is the answer. There's actually 5% of people that only need 4 to 5 hours of sleep every night. That's just the way they are. I'm not one of them. I wish I was. Most people need about 7 hours on minimum. But how can you measure it for yourself? You might need more, you might need a little less. Well, if you feel consistently alert during the day, that's a good measure that you've had enough sleep. If you fall asleep just when you're sitting in a chair or when you're up in a supermarket, just falling asleep when you're driving, that's a bad sign. You're sleep deprived. Need to get more sleep. So what about sleep? There was a study that looked at some people, and again, telomere length, and they grouped them into older adults and middle-aged adults. What we found is if you sleep over 7 hours, you do pretty good with telomere length, whether you're older or younger. But again, as you get less and less sleep, your telomere length goes down. That's to be expected, right? And especially the more elderly you are. But what about sleep quality? And again, quality is just as important as quantity. You can sleep for quite a few hours but have issues and not sleep well, and that's a problem. And it's also reflected in telomere length on this study. So how do you get good sleep quality? We have a problem invading America today, probably the world. People with their phones, in their beds, in their bedrooms, looking at screens. The thing is scientists have found that blue light from screens suppresses your melatonin. Melatonin is that sleep hormone that helps you sleep. So we know that if you're looking at screens within an hour of bedtime, you're not going to be sleeping as good. Your sleep quality isn't going to be as good as you would like it to be. And this is one of the studies that shows that. So if you go to the National Sleep Foundation website, you can find some tips for sleep. First off, most phones have something called night shift. Are you guys aware of that? Night shift is something where you can switch the blue light on your phone to a more yellow light, a calmer light, and a light that doesn't suppress melatonin. That's one way around it. You can buy blue light screen protectors, you can buy blue glasses to block the light, or you can keep your devices out of your bedroom for an hour before you go to bed. Those are all good options. Don't forget, TVs, computers, same thing. That blue light exposure counts. Other things to do, if you don't have a cool room, a dark room, or a quiet room, you can wear a mask, earplugs, etc. That will help with your sleep. And then sleep apnea. Sleep apnea is this really important thing, and if it goes untreated, it can contribute to really serious medical issues. So best to get that diagnosed and treated if there's any issues. Questions on sleep? Okay, we're on to the last one, periodic reboot. And this is one, I will admit, when I first heard of this reboot type topic, I was a little leery. I thought maybe there was something wrong with that. What is the deal with this? But for me, after reading the research, it makes a lot of sense. So with periodic reboot, I mean one of a few things. Caloric restriction, which interestingly enough, if you eat a whole food plant-based diet, you're already kind of doing that because you're reducing your calories by about 20 to 30% compared to people that eat the standard American diet. That's one of the reasons why they think vegetarians live longer, because we do know in a lot of studies that they do. Okay, so there's one. Next one would be intermittent fasting. And then the last one is time-restricted eating. So those are the three strategies that the data has really been coming out. It's one of the new frontiers for longevity research. So let's talk about fasting. There's many different types. It's kind of the rage. If you go on the internet, there's all sorts of books, diet plans, etc., on fasting. There's complete alternate day fasting, where you fast every other day. Be pretty hard to do. There's other modified fasting regimes, right? You can consume 20 to 25% of what you normally would 2 days a week, and the rest of the 5 days eat like you normally would. That's one option. Time-restricted feeding, which I think is a pretty palatable option, is finishing your dinner pretty early in the day and then eating your breakfast later the next day. So you have this prolonged period of time where you're not stressing your GI tract and letting it rest. And then there's religious fasting. Almost every major religion in the world has fasting somehow incorporated into it. In Islam, they have Ramadan, that's the fasting. Seventh-day Adventists, same thing. The LDS Church, same thing. There's a lot of religions that incorporate fasting, and you have to wonder why. So what are the benefits of fasting? Well, we know it changes your metabolism, and it changes how you regulate your metabolism. And one of the things is it decreases inflammation. And that does make sense, because if you think about it, you're not exposing your one cell wall layer thick intestine to toxins 24/7. You're giving it a break and allowing it to rejuvenate. With fasting, you also have increased insulin sensitivity, so you have better control of diabetes and blood glucose. You also have increased satiety hormones, so those hormones that make you feel full. Fasting has been shown to make a big difference in conditions like diabetes mellitus, cardiovascular disease, and there's even some rare reports of cancers being either prevented or treated with intermittent fasting. So how does it work? Well, we have a circadian clock. Our circadian clock is governed by something called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Suprachiasmatic nucleus is this teeny little thing in our brain. It's about the size of a peanut, roughly. And what it does is it controls everything. It wants to know when we sleep, when we eat, when we do certain things during the day, when we want to be the most active, when we can tolerate more activity. It controls all of that. And what happens is these all play a part together. We know our gut microbiome changes depending on the time of day, or whether we are, for example, sleep deprived or jet lagged. Studies have shown if you're jet lagged, your microbiome changes. It's interesting stuff. All three of these factors, so the gut microbiome, intermittent fasting, and then your modifiable factors play a role in conjunction with the circadian clock to regulate inflammation and all these other hormones. At the end of the day, poor regulation is going to lead to chronic diseases, and they've shown that. So they call it circadian misalignment. So people who are shift workers, policemen, firemen, nurses, they've been shown to have a higher incidence of heart disease, obesity, diabetes, etc. You guys know what the most common cause of death in firefighters is? It's not fighting fires or smoke. It's heart disease, dying of heart disease, which is quite interesting. We know that when your circadian clock is misaligned, it's associated with greater postprandial glucose levels. So you have issues controlling your blood sugars, especially if you're diabetic. It leads to an elevated hemoglobin A1C, which is a measure of your blood sugar control over time. And then you have increased cardiovascular risk. So this slide I thought was super interesting. What it's talking about is circadian coordination of energetics. And what you can see is that around the clock, based on different times of the day, we have different things that are active and not active. So if you look here at about 8 o'clock, for example, your melatonin secretion starts. We know most women get their menopausal hot flashes 10, 11 p.m., like clockwork, right? Our deepest sleep is early in the morning. Our lowest body temperature is early in the morning. We know statistically your highest probability of death is early in the morning. 5 to 6, 4, that's when most people unfortunately pass away. We know your highest risk of an MI is mid-morning. We know that based on your circadian clock and the hormones that are circulating throughout your body at that time. This brings into importance more, the circadian clock, fasting, or some sort of caloric restriction. So how can we do this? I'm sure some of you are looking at me saying, yeah, you're crazy. I'm never going to do this. I love food way too much, right? How can we do this? What are some strategies we can do to make this work for us? First off, check with your doctor. There are some people that need a medically supervised fast. Make sure that it's something that's okay with your physician. One way you could do it is just block off 1 to 2 days per year, and that can be your fast, water fast, just a reboot once a year, then you're done. Another way you could do it, you could finish dinner early, or you could eat a late breakfast, right? That's the time-restricted eating. Fit all of your eating into 10 to 12 hours a day. You could do what you do with a whole food plant-based diet and just decrease your intake by 20 to 25% 2 days a week. That's a strategy that works. So that's the 5-prong approach, the 5 different things, which I think are pretty simple, pretty easy to implement when it comes to healthy aging. I wanted to highlight one thing from Dean Ornish, one of the pioneers really in researching heart disease, et cetera. What he did is he took his group of patients with prostate cancer and he had them implement his Ornish plan, which has 4 of the 5 facets of the plan we talked about today. He had them do that for 5 years, and then he measured their telomere lengths and their results. And what he found in the intervention group, their telomeres got longer, meaning their telomerase was more active, and in the group that was the control group, they actually got shorter, which is consistent with normal aging. So this tells us, at least in this population as well, that there could be an increase in telomere length when you incorporate all of these multiple factors together. So again, 5 simple things, right? You've got the food, which is arguably the most important and the biggest thing that we can do to change and decrease inflammation and aging. We've got exercise, which is also super, super important. We have mindfulness, we have sleep, and then we've got that periodic reboot. And I think they're all very important for healthy aging. In my research, I came across 2 books that I highly recommend if you guys are into some good reading. The Telomere Effect is a book on the left. It's written by Elizabeth Blackburn. She's the lady that won the Nobel Prize for discovering telomerase. She wrote this book. She talks about telomeres, she talks about her research. Very good read. The next one over here is called The Alzheimer's Solution. It's by Team Shirzai. It's a husband and wife doctor team. And basically, they talk about curing Alzheimer's, preventing Alzheimer's and cognitive decline, primarily through many things, but a whole food plant-based diet is their main pillar. So I recommend those for reading. And lastly, if you don't know us yet online or on YouTube, please come find us. We make some very fun videos. We talk a lot about healthful living, etc. Please feel free to subscribe and get in touch with us. We love having interactive conversations. So with that, I will end and I'll take any questions. Sure, so the question was about commercial kits regarding figuring out how long your telomeres are, and there are companies that do that. I would argue that their science is not quite advanced enough yet. What they're doing is not the same as the lab tests where they're measuring the telomeres. Once you do give them your sample, though, it is very well preserved. I wouldn't worry about degradation or anything like that. But would I hang my hat on one single telomere length test? Probably not. Good question. So there's a small subset of the population that is celiac, and definitely gluten causes issues. For the other people, gluten does not necessarily cause inflammation. There are some people that are gluten sensitive, and you can find that out even subjectively by how you feel right after you eat gluten. But I don't think that being gluten-free is the correct diet for everybody. I think that there's a big role for whole grains, for other types of gluten, and they're a very important part of a whole food plant-based diet. So avoiding them just because some people say that they're pro-inflammatory, I don't agree with that. But on that note, with the gluten, you want to make sure you don't want to be eating gluten to be eating those simple white breads, the sugars, that type of stuff, because that we know is pro-inflammatory, but not necessarily because of the gluten, if that makes sense.
Mahalo to all of you for coming, and have a safe return home tonight. Good night, everyone.